Hey sports ballers, and welcome to the third episode of the Learn Sports Ball Show. My name is Austin Goss, and today is the last day you'll know nothing about fantasy football. So as I was preparing for this week's episode, I found myself kind of guessing or wondering what we should be talking about. I know I brought it up last time that maybe it would be a good idea to talk about basketball, baseball, something other than football. But as I really got to thinking about kind of the conversations that happen and some of the things you may not know about sports, I started to realize that fantasy sports are a big part of that too. And so this week's episode, we're going to actually talk through fantasy football. Now, for those of you that have never played, it's a pretty straightforward process, but I want to break it down for you in really easily understandable terms. You might have a husband that plays that's really big into that. You may be aware of all the drafts that are happening, all of the different things that go into fantasy football. So I want to talk about why people do it, what the fun is in it, and just kind of let you know where to start. Fantasy football is a really fun thing to do if you have the time to do it and do it well. I actually got into fantasy sports a long time ago, way before they were ever a thing. Probably, back in the early 2010s is when I really started playing some of those fantasy sports, and maybe even before that. And I was really big into fantasy baseball. I will say up front, I've never actually played fantasy football personally, but I understand all the ins and outs of the game and how it's played and what you're doing and why people are so fascinated with it. So let's start with something that I would just recall from the prior episodes that we've had, specifically the first episode, talking about the social aspect of sports. So much of fantasy football is the social aspect. A lot of these leagues that people end up in where you have quite a few teams, somewhere in the range of usually like 8 to 14 teams participate in one of these leagues. They're buddies from high school, they're people from work, co-workers. You get into these leagues oftentimes through private invites. So there is a social aspect to it for sure, because oftentimes you are playing fantasy football with people that are part of some kind of social circle for you. Now, there's also the possibility of just joining a public league. Maybe you don't know anybody that actually plays fantasy football, but you want to get into it, try it out for yourself. There's public leagues on all types of websites. ESPN's a popular one. I used to play on Yahoo way back in the day, but I know there's probably better options now. But there's lots of different places where you can sign up for these leagues, and there's a public option where you can basically play against other people that nobody really knows each other. So there are several options, but usually you're going to be in these private leagues. Now, sometimes there's prize money involved for private leagues. Like sometimes often you may have heard like, hey, let's get $20 a piece. Everybody that's in the league running a team is going to pitch in $20. And at the end of the year, whoever wins gets to take home that pot. Or like if you lose, I know there's a lot of times some really funny viral moments that go out there of things like, hey, the person that loses and comes in last place in this league is going to have to get some kind of terrible tattoo. Now, I'm not advocating for that. I'm not saying that that's the best way to approach it, because obviously there's you may not be that committed to the process, but let's just say it's designed to be fun. It's designed to add some sort of intrigue around the league. That's not just about who wins the games in the actual NFL, but what your fantasy team does week in and week out. All right, so let's talk about the teams in fantasy football and kind of the basics now that you're in a league. So you've joined this private league with a bunch of your buddies, you've put into the prize pool, and now you're ready to get started. Scoring in these leagues is based off of actual NFL players. So every Sunday, every Monday, whichever players are playing on those days, if they happen to be on your team, which we'll talk about how they get there in a minute, that's where the points come from. So the actual performance of these NFL players dictates how your team performs within the fantasy football leagues. So for example, oftentimes there's a point for every 25 passing yards. There might be 4 points for a touchdown throw, 6 points for a rushing touchdown. The points can vary. Like this is just a very loose kind of interpretation of basic like ESPN rule sets, but I'm sure there's other ways that these things can be scored. But basically for any significant event or milestone that is happening within an NFL game, the players that are involved in those plays will accumulate points. And obviously the goal is score more points than your opponents, just like we've talked about in every other week of the Learn Sports Ball show thus far. So those are the basics. You have these NFL players that are competing on Sundays, Monday nights, Thursday nights, whenever they're playing, they're accumulating these points for your team. So that's really the first step, is scoring in scoring, I should say, is going through that process. So let's talk about actually building one of these teams. So I've referenced that you join a team and you're part of this league, right? But how do these players get on your team? Well, it's very similar to the actual NFL where you draft these players. So one of the big events that always everybody spends so much time preparing for is the draft. And this was my downfall when I played fantasy sports. I loved drafting players. I really loved if you remember our episode last week, I talked about kind of the role of a general manager, where they're really making roster decisions, they're drafting players, they're trading, they're looking for free agents that are available that might be able to help the team. That was my favorite part of it. The actual management of the lineups got pretty cumbersome because I think at some points I was signed up for like 6 or 8 leagues at a time, and I really just liked going through the draft process to see what kind of team I could build. But when it came to setting a lineup, and especially in baseball where every single day your team is playing, you have to adjust the lineups based on who's starting, who's not. It was exhausting. And so the NFL is a little bit better in the sense that you really can adjust these lineups a couple times a week, depending on matchups or depending on who's playing what days. But by and large, you don't have to worry so much about setting it every day because you know ahead of time generally who's going to be playing. So as we talk about the draft, usually it's a serpentine process where you start with the first pick, and that's usually arbitrarily determined in a private league, or it may be based off of the standings from the last year if it's the same players, right? So if everybody in there is the same people that were in there the year before, they may just decide, hey, if you finished in last place, you get first pick, going backwards through until the winner of the league last year has to get the 8th pick if it's an 8-team league. Now, typically there are quite a few rounds in these drafts. So it's a serpentine process. When you pick first overall, you're going to have to wait until, if it's like an 8-team league, you're going to wait until pick 16 to pick your next player. Whereas the player that maybe picks 8th overall in that league is also going to get the 9th pick. So it kind of goes in like a snake-like fashion, if you will, back and forth, depending on the standings or depending on the draft order. What's interesting about fantasy football is that running backs and wide receivers are actually the most valuable players, and this is not true in standard NFL play. The quarterback is the most valuable player on the field for just about every team in football, and even if it's not your best player, it's the most important position by far. It's inarguable that the quarterback position in a standard NFL game is what really dictates team success. In fantasy, running backs and wide receivers are most valuable, and the reason for that really is around scarcity or the availability of talent. In an 8-team league, there might not be 8 running backs that are considered the best running backs in the league. There might only be a couple running backs at any given point in time in the league that are really considered head and shoulders above the rest. The same is true for wide receivers. There's lots of wide receivers that play in the NFL, but when it comes to consistently scoring points for your fantasy team, those wide receivers, you might have a couple guys that are really head and shoulders above the rest as well too. Whereas quarterbacks, even the best quarterbacks from a statistical standpoint, may not actually be all that different from their peers, and there tends to be a deeper well to draw from because there usually is a fairly talented group of quarterbacks across the league, where if you get the, let's say, first or best quarterback, let's say it's Patrick Mahomes, is the, he'd be a good pick for the first overall quarterback in leagues like this. And then say someone like maybe one of my personal favorites, Kyler Murray. If both stay healthy, if both have well-performing offenses, the difference between their performance in a fantasy football scoring system is probably not going to be as different as you might think. And so ultimately, the positional importance is really focused in the early rounds on running backs and wide receivers. So you might take a running back or two, a wide receiver or two, before you actually draft other areas of the roster. Now, the other thing to call out is that a fantasy football team is not meant to mirror an actual football team. You're not drafting offensive linemen. You're not drafting individual defensive players. It's all based on offensive points and defensive points. So ultimately, you're drafting quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends to fill out your roster and what are referred to as flex players, which are players that play really any of those positions, but that will be filling kind of that flex role in your roster. You're also looking at drafting kickers and defensive players. So kickers obviously kick the points after touchdowns, they kick the field goals, so they're accumulating points for your team that could apply. And the defenses are also capable of scoring points. Let's say there's an interception that's returned for a touchdown or a fumble that's returned for a touchdown. So those kinds of things impact scoring in these leagues as well. Generally speaking, the kicker and the defense are going to be the last two picks in the draft. Like, you're going to build out your entire team based on the offensive skill players that are out there, because that's really where everybody's focusing their efforts. And again, if you draft the best kicker in the entire league, and let's say you do that 2 rounds prior to anybody else, the value that you're getting at that draft pick is probably less than what you would have gotten if you took, let's say, the 30th best wide receiver at that point. So positional value matters in fantasy football, and it's very different than how you would build an NFL roster. So just calling out that when we refer to the draft, it's a little bit more, I shouldn't say nuanced, because that's not the word I'm looking for, but I think more so just it's one of those processes that doesn't mirror the way you would build an actual team, because the point scoring is really what matters here. So let's say you have 14 spots to fill, and that's a totally made up number, but we'll say 14 players on a team. So you might have 2 quarterbacks, you might have several running backs, several wide receivers, you'll have a tight end or 2, you'll have the defense, the kicker. All of those are part of your actual team. And then when you get into the actual week, you're going to start setting up your lineup. So as we get into the NFL regular season, you're going to look at who's playing and what the matchups are, and maybe if there's favorable options versus not favorable options. So let's give a couple practical examples. Maybe you have the best running back in the league. You drafted the top overall running back available at the time, but week 1 of the NFL season, that running back happens to be going up against one of the best defenses in the league. And then maybe your second running back on your roster is actually playing against the worst rushing defense in the league. A lot of times people will make the decision to say, hey, I'm going to play that second best running back because it's a more favorable matchup. And sometimes they won't. Maybe they'll roll the dice and say, hey, I still think that my best player is going to be better than that defense that they're playing against. The same thing holds true for wide receivers against passing defenses or quarterbacks against passing defenses. So there's a positional matchup that matters here, where if you are playing in these games in the actual NFL, some teams you're going to match up worse against than others, especially at individual positions on offense. And so that is something that a prudent league leader or a prudent team GM in a fantasy football league would be mindful of as they go into that. You can adjust the lineups all the way up until kickoff, which is a really cool feature of fantasy football, in that you can kind of make decisions up until game time. And part of the reason for that is like things like injury or last minute things that you might not have been aware of because it wasn't reported out by the team. A lot of times there might be an injured player that we don't know if they're going to play or not until right before game time or a game time decision. So when you're setting your roster, it's good to have that flexibility and be able to think about, when can I put that player in, and how long or what point do I have as like a drop dead stopping point? So you can set these rosters all the way up until a player's game kicks off. The other thing that we haven't talked about yet, and I probably should have talked about during the draft process, but we'll talk now, is there's always projections by a myriad of sports experts where they go through and actually project, okay, of all these NFL players, of all these different people that you could draft from these different teams, every quarterback, every running back, every wide receiver, etc., I'm going to rank every single one of them, at least to a certain point. Maybe not every single player in the league, but enough that everybody in your league could draft one of these players based off of projections and rankings. And so it's really interesting to consider how those rankings are set and how you end up with the types of players that you'd want. Who is quarterback 1 versus quarterback 30? Who is wide receiver 5 versus wide receiver 10? What's the gap there? Are there things that happened during the NFL offseason that might impact that? Maybe, like, what's very common is a lot of this is projection. You're looking at historical data to determine we expect this player to gain X amount of yards and score Y number of touchdowns based on what they've done historically, based on the team that they're currently on and the roster construction around them in the actual league. And so all of that plays into making these decisions. So it's not as if you go into these drafts or go into this team building or setting these lineups in fantasy football and not having some kind of understanding of who is your best player, because so much of that is projected by these experts that follow football very closely and are really in tune with all of the nuances that I just described, and then go ahead and put out there, hey, here's what we project to happen. Now, one of the things that also just can always tank a fantasy football season are injuries. You may have a really terrible situation or a really unlucky draft where you draft a bunch of really great players, but then within the first few weeks of the year, they all get hurt and they miss 4 to 6 weeks or, possibly the entire season. So now you got to go find a replacement. And the replacements that you're looking at are guys that maybe nobody drafted. And so they're not going to be the best players. They're sitting out there as free agents that you could theoretically pick up and add to your team, but they're certainly not going to be of the caliber, at least in theory, that the players you drafted were. So fantasy football can be really wild in terms of the swings and the outcomes that you can have, just like an actual NFL season could be, where if your best player gets hurt, you might be in a rough situation for the rest of the year. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind are bye weeks. As we talked about last week in Football 101, bye weeks are those weeks during the season where a team doesn't actually play. Every team in the NFL has that 1 week off at some point during the season. So if you set your lineup, but your best player happens to be on their bye week and you forget to change that, tough luck, you're going to be stuck because they weren't playing, so they're not going to score any points for you. So that's also something to keep in mind as you're setting these lineups every week, is making sure that your players are playing, that the matchups are favorable, and that ultimately it gives you an opportunity to compete at the highest level. Now, when you have these matchups, very often you're going head to head. So in my experience, there are 2 different ways that you can go about scoring in a fantasy football league, or rather the matchups or how you kind of determine who is the winner at the end of the year. Most of these leagues are head to head, where every week you're playing against one of the other teams, just like you would in the NFL, and whoever wins that week gets the win. Whoever loses that game gets the loss. In fantasy baseball, I played a little bit different format where it was not me against another team. It was actually me against the points that every team scored over the course of an entire season. So it was less about individual matchups and playing against the teams that I was facing, but more just trying to score the most points overall. So there are 2 different scoring systems, but in the NFL, or rather in fantasy football, you're very often talking about head-to-head matchups where you're really just trying to beat the team that you're playing against that week. So tiebreakers, like let's say 2 of the 8 teams finish with the same record at the end of the year, then things like point differential or total points scored would come into that equation to figure out who actually came out on top. So another interesting thing about fantasy football is it mirrors NFL roster construction in a lot of ways. And I know I already referenced that with the draft, but there's also things like free agency and the waiver wire. The waiver wire is not a concept we've discussed yet, so let's dive into that. Sometimes what you'll see is, let's say you drafted somebody that was projected to be the best running back in the league, and they have a really slow start to the year. Maybe for the first 4 weeks, they've run for far less yards than you would prefer. They're not scoring any touchdowns, and so they're really holding your team back, and you're already a quarter of the way through the season. An owner or a general manager of one of these teams might decide, hey, I just got to cut this guy loose because I need to find somebody. Maybe there's another running back that you didn't know was going to have a great season that's off to a really hot start, and you think he's going to serve my team better than that player I drafted really high. You might release the player that was projected to do really well and is just not having a great year. And they go on to what's called waivers, where there's a certain time period in which everybody in the league, if they decide, hey, I actually want to go pick that player up, I see they had a slow start this year, they're not rushing for a lot of yards, but also I know their potential, and I'm projecting, again, that I think they're going to be better than what their stats have been so far. In those situations, when you put those waiver claims in, there's an order, and often that order is based again off of record. The worst teams in the league will have first waiver claims, at least in the beginning of the season, and the best teams in the league will be last in that lineup. So if every team in the league, aside from the team that just released this player, puts in that waiver claim, you're going to have to be first in line to be able to claim that player or be awarded that player. And that's very similar to how the NFL works. In the actual NFL, when a player is cut from a team, there is often a waiver period for like veterans or certain situations where their contracts or the league rules dictate that you can't just sign them outright. They actually have the opportunity to be claimed by some other team. If the team puts in a claim on the waiver wire, they'll be awarded that player if nobody else does it or if they're the first in line. So it's really interesting how fantasy football actually mirrors the NFL roster construction in a lot of ways. And I referenced free agency, which again, we talked about last week, but the same concept of there's also players that just weren't drafted. They haven't been released by another team in the league. They're just sitting out there to be picked up for free if you want to go out and grab them. So at any point in time, if there's a free agent out there, it doesn't matter if you're the best or the worst team in the league. You can go out and grab one of those players if you would like them, even for just a week. You see a lot of times where teams in fantasy football will opt to pick up a player for 1 week based on a very favorable matchup, and then the next week swap them out for somebody else. So there's all different ways that you can go about doing this, but ultimately the way that rosters are built are the same that they are in the NFL in terms of the waiver and free agency. Of course, without the real money involved, you don't have to pay these players, which is nice because I don't think anybody listening to this podcast would be able to afford paying the salary of an actual NFL player on their fantasy football team. So thankful for that. One thing we haven't touched on yet, but certainly exists within fantasy football leagues as well, is the trade block, trading players. You can trade players between teams. That's not a word, Austin. Between teams at any point really in the timeline. There's usually a trade deadline. So let's say, by week 12 or week 13, there's usually going to be a deadline imposed where you cannot trade after a certain point in the season. And this is also true of the NFL. But in fantasy football, before the trade deadline, if you look at somebody else's team and you say, hey, this team is like really awesome and I really would like to take one of their players if I could, you can go to that owner and say, hey, I'd like to propose a trade. I'll give you this player and maybe this player for this player. Now, obviously those trades have to be a lot of times mutually beneficial, unless you find someone that's just totally given up on the year and they decide, I don't care what happens with my team. I'm going to lose the league anyway. So I'm kind of just having a fire sale to trade my best players to the other teams. Like, this is not a very common scenario, but it's theoretically possible. Then you might be able to get a good player for a lower price. But generally speaking, if you go to propose a trade to someone else, they're going to expect something good in return. And this is also true of the NFL. Now, there's dynamics that play into that on a deeper level in professional football and professional roster construction. But I think it's important to at least call out that if you find some kind of agreeable trade with someone in your league, you'll be able to negotiate that. And you guys, if you decide, hey, we both agree to this trade, then it's okay to go through and get it done. So you may be able to grab somebody halfway through, and maybe you go to that guy that's about to release a player that's having a slow start, like we talked about, and you're able to negotiate a favorable trade based on the fact that they're just not performing yet. And maybe you've got one of those players that starts out hot and you think, hey, I know this guy's probably not going to continue this performance throughout the year, so I might be able to quote unquote sell high and buy low on maybe a player that's underperforming. So let's talk about the playoffs. So let's say you're one of the best 4 teams in your league. You'll typically advance to the playoffs, and the playoffs work very similarly to the regular playoffs in the NFL. Now, it's important to note, we talked about last week that the NFL regular season is 18 weeks with each team playing 17 games. In fantasy football, you actually have to have the window shut down by the time the NFL regular season ends, simply because not every NFL team plays in the playoffs. So that would exclude some of the players that are certainly on these rosters that are part of this, that you'll have to pull them, like they just can't score points because they're not part of the playoffs. So typically, in the first 14 weeks of the NFL season, that is the regular season for fantasy football. And then the final 4 weeks are typically based on the playoffs for the fantasy football league. So weeks 15 through 18 are playoff weeks in fantasy football. And this is where the championship is determined. So obviously, if you've played well throughout the year, you've performed well, and you've got one of the best teams in the league, you'll have a chance to compete for that money maybe that you threw in at the beginning, and really, have I don't know if a claim to fame is the right way to call it, but bragging rights if you're playing with your buddies. So this is a really cool opportunity to, kind of gloat a little bit, have a little bit of fun. And that's really important to keep context on this, is that these types of things are supposed to be fun. They're not supposed to be the most serious thing in the world. However, if money's involved, I'm sure that it's one of those things that can get pretty competitive, and there can be a lot of emotions wrapped up when everybody actually stands to potentially lose or win something in these scenarios. So again, there's playoffs in fantasy football, just like there is in regular football, to help determine the champion of the league. One of my favorite things about fantasy football, as a big pun fan and just someone who really loves like silly, stupid jokes, things like that, naming a fantasy football team is something that a lot of people take immense pride in. And it's something I remember being very proud of when I was younger, coming up with the most witty or punny or whatever kind of name that I could come up with. And very often these names are based off of either the teams or the players in the league at the time. So just a few examples. I'm looking at a list here that has some of the names that are out there this year for potential fantasy football names. There are, so I'll try to use some players or pick out the ones for players that you might be familiar with. I see one here, Sherlock Mahomes. So kind of like Sherlock Holmes, but referring to Patrick Mahomes. I'm not going to describe every one of these. I'm sure you can probably understand, but I think that's a pretty good one. Dak Street Boys, referring to Dak Prescott of the Cowboys. That's a pretty good one too. Kissing Cousins, I like that. Kirk Cousins being a quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons, previously for the Vikings and the Washington Commanders, and a name that we will not talk about on this show. Saving Matt Ryan, former Atlanta Falcons quarterback. Two's Company, Three's a Stroud. So you can see there's lots of To Affinity and Beyond. Beg, Burrow, and Steele. Like, there's lots of really good names out there. And one of the things that people just enjoy so much about this is coming up with the best name. And these are just quarterback based names. Like, I haven't even gotten into some of these names for some of the running backs that are out there. Bijan Mustard, or Let Bijans Be Bijans, which is a reference to Bijan Robinson, one of the running backs for the Atlanta Falcons. Really popular team on this already. So there's just so many different ways you can go with this, and I really enjoy that aspect of it. And it's very possible or probable that if you have someone that you care about that plays fantasy football, they're really proud of the name they came up with too. One other final dynamic I'd like to talk about when it comes to building fantasy football rosters is the approach that says, I'm not going to try to build the best possible team. I'm going to build the team that I like the most or that I enjoy the most. As an example, for me as a Cardinals fan, I'd probably show a preference. Like if I'm looking at two different players and they're relatively similar in performance, but one happens to be a Cardinal and one happens to not be, I'm probably going to pick the Cardinal just because of my personal preference in teams. For that same logic, I'm also probably likely to decline drafting someone from one of my rivals in a similar situation. They might be the best available player, but there might be someone right behind them. And if I'm picking between someone I got to draft from, let's say the 49ers or some random AFC team that I don't care about, I'm going to go with the AFC player because ultimately it's like it's petty, right? It's my attempt to say, hey, I don't like you guys. Spoiler alert, when I say I don't like them, it's not really that I have some kind of disdain for them personally, but the team and the franchise are rivals. And so, yeah, I don't want to draft your players because I'm just petty that way. And I think that's how a lot of people look at it. Similarly, you may decide to build like a theme team based on, I don't know, player names, initials. You might decide that you're just only going to draft players from one team. I wouldn't take it that far. Like, I don't think drafting only the players from your favorite NFL team is a good draft strategy, because you're probably limiting yourself pretty severely in fantasy football. But there's certainly people out there that do that. I liken it to, like, let's go back to our Avengers references that I've gone to in the past. You might have Iron Man and Thor and I don't know, like Spider-Man, all of these like really, really like superheroes, right? But then you decide to go down the list and like find the really like minor characters that nobody even talks about. And I wouldn't even know who to name at this point, just referring to like, maybe you just have a personal preference for some super obscure off the wall hero in that universe. So you build a team around that. You know that you're probably not going to be taking out the Spider-Men and the Thors and the Iron Men of the world, let's say, or Captain America or what have you, but you're just doing it to have fun. And you're like, I like this team. It's scrappy. It's my personality. So that's certainly the kind of thing that can happen with fantasy football drafts too, where rather than drafting the best players, maybe you decide, I just want to draft the players that I think are going to make the most fun team. So there's lots of ways you can go about approaching this. And every once in a while, one of those meme teams, if you will, ends up actually doing pretty well out of the blue, maybe for some of the reasons we've already discussed: injuries hitting some of those better players, projections being off about who's going to be doing well and who's not. So that's another dynamic here that I think is really fun about fantasy football. The other thing that I think can be a drawback to fantasy football, and I want to call out, is that because you are rooting for individual players to score points, you might find yourself in a situation where your favorite team is playing against that player that's also on your fantasy football team. So now you're rooting against your own favorite team, or you're at least rooting for a player on the other team to score a bunch of points. Maybe it's the last player to play a game on your team and you need them to score, let's say, 30 points for the week for you to win that matchup. You're going to be rooting pretty hard for a player that is actually opposing the team that you would cheer for in regular life. So like, what I have not ever really liked about fantasy football specifically is I would hate to be in a situation where I'm watching a Cardinals game and I am actively rooting for someone on the other team to do really well against my team. And like, I don't think this happens a ton of the time. Like, I'm sure there's a healthy tension where you can acknowledge it'd be great if this player scored a bunch of points for my fantasy team. So maybe I really hope they perform well, but also I hope that my favorite actual NFL team wins this game. So I'm sure there's like the ability to kind of rationalize that. But man, I don't know what I would do if I were in a situation where it's the end of the game and my choices are either A, my fantasy football player scores the winning touchdown to allow the opponent to win, or my favorite actual NFL team wins the game by getting that crucial stop and preventing that touchdown against the player on my fantasy team. So that's another dynamic to just consider, that like this could actually have some negative ramifications for how you watch football on Sundays. Ultimately, though, I think fantasy football is a really fascinating window into like just how NFL teams are built, how you would kind of work on building a good team to compete week in and week out. And while it doesn't mirror actual NFL rosters, I think it can help you not only be tuned into how the league works by watching these individual players, understanding how they score points, not just in the NFL, but also for your fantasy team. And it really just gives you a reason to be engaged with some of these games. Now, another risk that I will just call out is that if you're a fantasy football, let's say you have 10 different fantasy football teams and you just go crazy with it, you might be prone to want to watch every single game all of the time because you're so interested in how your team's going to perform. And I would just caution, like, I love sports. I love watching football. Football season is one of my favorite times of the year, but there's got to be a healthy balance. Like, I don't have 5 games on at a time tracking what every player is doing. So just be mindful of, you might only want to do like 1 or 2 teams at a time if you're going to get into this. And if you've never played it before, it's actually a super easy way to just kind of dip your toes in the water, get to know some of the players in the league, even understand who the best players are at any given point in time based on those projections and the performance throughout the season. So ultimately, I hope this week's episode was fun. I wanted to do something a little bit different. And this is kind of my signal that that when we talk about learning sports ball in general, I'm not just going to focus on the true sports themselves. I want to spend some time focusing on the cultural things like fantasy football that happen around them. I want to spend some time talking about the human aspect of these things, which I know we've already kind of referenced to in the past. But there's a lot of really exciting content that I'm looking forward to bringing around all of this, right? So I would encourage you, continue to listen in. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me today. Final plug, as I've done for every other episode thus far, this is new for me. I'm now in episode 3. I've been working hard posting things on my socials, so please go to YouTube because this is going to be the first week I've actually recorded video alongside my audio podcast. So when you go to the podcast this week on my YouTube at Learn Sports Ball, you're going to see my face, whether or not you want to. It'll be there. I've recorded this entire episode, and I'm kind of excited to see what the engagement looks like because, frankly, the YouTube channel is really the one that struggled the most to get off the ground. I'm also on TikTok, and I'm posting, obviously, shorter form content there at Learn Sports Ball as well. But some funnier stuff, some sillier stuff. I've gotten goofy with it, but also tried to be informative and give you some shorter windows into some of these human stories, some of the humor that I find in sports. So I'd encourage you to follow me there, and it would be really helpful because ultimately the best way you can support me as I go through this journey to try to just share the world of sports ball with everyone around me is following me, liking my content, kind of keeping up what's going on, not just within this podcast, but in all those channels. So please, if you go to learnsportsball.com, you'll see links to every social that I have. I'm easy to find in all of these places, and I'm going to continue putting out this content. I appreciate your patience. I know I was a little bit late in getting this episode out this week. A lot of life happening. School just started back up, so I've got kid transportation, events, sports. My son is in my son started football. So just so many things happening in life around us. Got my 4th child on the way in about a month. So there's just so many things that I'm excited for. This is a really sweet and rich season in my life. And this brand is just an extension of that. So I hope you've enjoyed your time here today. Thank you so much for joining in to the Learn Sports Ball Show, the 3rd episode, and I will see you next week, Sports Ballers.